James, still clinging to his justification, spoke again. "You're acting like we're villains. We're just trying to protect our family. And if you're serious about joining it, you should be willing to step up." James wasn't far behind. He started sending me articles, yes, actual articles, about cultural traditions involving financial gifts from grooms. He followed up with a list of financial tips for building wealth early in marriage, as though I needed guidance from the man trying to extort me under the guise of family values. My fiancé's parents told me that if I truly wanted to marry their daughter, I needed to do something extraordinary, pay off their entire mortgage. I kept a straight face and smiled, but what I revealed next shattered their pristine family image completely. When the cafe manager handed me the folder James had left behind, I wasn't sure what I was expecting. He'd said it was nothing, just some financial notes, but something about the way he guarded it during our meeting, and then the way he brushed it off afterward, had made me suspicious. I opened it slowly, flipping through the contents right there in my car. At first glance, it looked like a collection of random financial paperwork, mortgage statements, printed spreadsheets, some old receipts, and what seemed like notes James had scribbled in the margins for his own reference. For a moment, I thought maybe I had overreacted. Maybe it really was just a bunch of dull household records. Every time I tried to share my concerns with Lauren, she'd deflect. "That's just how my dad is," she said. "He means well. He just has a strong personality." But to me, this wasn't just strong-willed parenting. It was coercion. They were treating me like an ATM with a pulse, not a human being preparing to spend his life with their daughter. I'm a 29-year-old man, and up until a few weeks ago I believed I had life pretty well sorted out. I was engaged to Lauren, this truly wonderful woman who made every day feel like a new adventure. She was witty, sharp, and incredibly easy to get along with. We met a couple of years back during a casual game night organized by some mutual friends. There was an immediate spark. Her sense of humor mirrored mine, and conversation with her never felt forced. We clicked almost instantly. The gall of that statement left me speechless for a second. Then I said, "You want me to step up by paying for your mistakes, your secrets, and your lies. And the prize is? What? Acceptance into this circus?" But then I noticed something strange. Eventually, I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I told Lauren that we needed a real, honest conversation about this tradition and where we stood as a couple. We sat down in our apartment, and I took a deep breath before asking, "Do you really think it's okay for your parents to expect me to pay off their mortgage?" I looked James dead in the eye. "You don't get to decide what's best for me, and if this is what being part of your family looks like, I want no part of it." Our relationship progressed naturally. There weren't any wild arguments or dramatic fights, just two people who shared similar dreams and complemented each other's personalities. We'd often talk about our future, buying a house together, starting a family, exploring the world one country at a time. It was like one of those perfect love stories you hear about, and I was all in. After dating for a year, I proposed. The setting was simple and intimate, just the two of us at the same park where we'd had our first date. She cried and said yes. Everything about that moment felt like something out of a dream. In the early days of our engagement, things went smoothly. We were caught up in the whirlwind of planning, picking out wedding venues, discussing catering options, choosing color palettes. Her parents, James and Patricia, were very involved from the beginning. That didn't bother me initially. I figured most parents would want a say in their daughter's wedding, especially if they were emotionally or financially invested. But James and Patricia weren't just involved, they were overly assertive. Patricia gasped like I had slapped her. James' face turned a deeper shade of red. "Maybe you're not as committed to Lauren's as we thought," he said. She didn't respond right away. Her silence stretched on until it became uncomfortable. Finally, she said, "It's not about the money. It's about showing respect. To them, this is how you prove you're serious about being part of the family." Tucked among the papers was a receipt that didn't seem to belong. It wasn't for anything home. Instead, it listed a payment made out to a place called Alden Ridge Estates. I'd never heard of it, but the name didn't sound like a bank or a financial institution. Curious, I pulled out my phone and Googled it. I looked at her, feeling both disbelief and disappointment. "Lauren, I proposed because I'm serious about you. I love you. That should be enough. But paying off someone else's house? That doesn't show love or respect. It shows submission. And I'm not okay with that." James, her father, carried himself like he had all the answers. Having retired from a long career in finance, he loved using corporate buzzwords in casual conversations. He was the type to call an argument a cost-benefit analysis and referred to relationship decisions as investments. Patricia, on the other hand, was obsessed with maintaining appearances. Her standards were sky-high, and anything that didn't meet them earned a tight-lipped smile or a subtle jab disguised as a compliment. That was it, the final push. At first, their behavior came off as typical in-law quirks. James dismissed the venue I'd suggested because it wasn't conveniently located for his golfing buddies. Patricia criticized our catering choice, hinting it wasn't refined enough. I let those comments slide. Lauren often took their side, but I brushed it off as her trying to keep the peace. I stood and looked directly at Lauren. I wanted to build a life with you, but the respect I had is already broken. I can't marry into a family that sees me as a wallet and nothing more. And I can't be with someone who lets them. My heart stopped. She sighed, clearly torn. I get why you're upset, she said slowly. But they're just old-fashioned. My dad thinks a man should take on a big responsibility when he joins the family. That's how they were raised. Alden Ridge Estates wasn't a mortgage broker. It wasn't a retirement community or a financial firm. It was a luxury rehabilitation facility, one of those discreet, ultra-private centers that cater to wealthy clients dealing with addictions, gambling, substance abuse, behavioral therapy. Everything was high-end, quiet, and very, very expensive. Lauren's eyes brimmed with tears, but she didn't stop me. She didn't say a word. Old-fashioned? That wasn't old-fashioned. It was manipulative, borderline predatory. And the more I reflected, the more convinced I became that Lauren's parents were leveraging her to get to me. They knew she mattered to me, and they were betting that I'd cave just to avoid conflict. Soon, though, their critiques turned into expectations. Patricia began making sly remarks about traditional roles, often saying, well, the groom's side usually covers the big wedding costs, right? Or, a real man provides for his new family, including the in-laws. At first I laughed these off, but the repetition wore on me. They weren't joking. They were testing the waters, seeing how far they could push me. James opened his mouth again, but I raised my hand. You've said enough, I told him. This conversation is over. Lauren and I had already agreed that I'd handle the bulk of the wedding expenses, covering the venue and catering. Her parents were supposed to be in charge of flowers and decorations, but even that turned into a saga. Patricia kept suggesting lavish floral arrangements, exotic centerpieces, and lighting packages that far exceeded the budget. When I expressed concerns, she'd let out a dramatic sigh followed by a guilt-tripping, I guess we'll have to settle. Suddenly, everything started to click into place. I went back to the receipts, combing through them more carefully this time. A few were for regular household expenses, sure, but several others lined up with Alden Ridge's billing structure. I cross-referenced dates with James's notes. Terms like intake, treatment review, and final phase were jotted down, mostly in shorthand. But I could read between the lines. Things escalated further over the next week. Patricia amped up her guilt campaign, bringing up her past sacrifices at every opportunity. She'd slip them into casual conversations, like we gave Lauren the best we could and now it's someone else's turn. James continued his own campaign, emailing spreadsheets and diagrams, detailing various mortgage payoff strategies, as if he were managing a client's portfolio. And with that I walked out of their house, my heart pounding with a confusing mix of sadness, anger, and relief. Despite the tension, I kept my frustrations to myself. I told myself that marrying Lauren meant dealing with her family, flaws and all. That was, until an unforgettable dinner at their house changed everything. James had spent months at Alden Ridge. The mortgage they kept talking about? That wasn't the crisis. That wasn't the debt they were trying to cover. One night, Patricia finally said it out loud. It's not like we're asking you to do something outrageous. It's just a house. It's an investment. For the family's future. It was the rehab bill. The family's future. I nearly snapped. Whose future were we even discussing? Not mine. Lauren and I hadn't even started planning for our own home yet. We hadn't saved for a honeymoon or budgeted for our wedding. And they expected me to throw tens of thousands of dollars into their home while putting ours on hold? The selfishness was breathtaking. We'd been invited over for what I assumed would be another typical evening. James rambled about his golf game and Patricia showed off her latest Pinterest board filled with elaborate wedding ideas. I was halfway through my drink when James suddenly shifted the tone. With a straight face he announced, "We need to discuss something important with you." When I got home, I sat in silence for a long time before finally sending Lauren a text. I leaned in, expecting a heart-to-heart about marriage or perhaps even a conversation about joining their family. But instead, James said, "In our family, there's a tradition. When a man marries into our family, he demonstrates his commitment by taking on a meaningful responsibility, specifically paying off our mortgage. I need some time to think. Please don't call me for now." I started asking myself the uncomfortable questions. Had they been planning this all along? Was this part of some unspoken expectation they'd crafted before I ever proposed? Did Lauren know more than she was letting on? Had she chosen not to tell me out of fear or worse, agreement? The real emergency wasn't about preserving the family home. It was about cleaning up James's personal disaster. All those emotional appeals, the guilt trips, the so-called family traditions, it had been a smokescreen from the very beginning. They'd tried to spin a tale of legacy and respect to cover up something much darker and deeply personal. I nearly spat out my drink. I laughed, thinking this was one of James's dry jokes, but he didn't flinch. He was serious, completely serious. She didn't reply. Then came the dinner that nearly broke me. They weren't being overbearing parents. They were hiding a secret and manipulating me into footing the bill. I spent the rest of the night alone, staring at my phone, half expecting it to buzz with a message from Lauren. It didn't. And somehow, that silence said more than words ever could. It was the clearest sign yet that maybe we weren't on the same side anymore. I was stunned. James and Patricia invited us over, saying they wanted to clear the air. For a brief moment I was hopeful. Maybe they'd come to their senses. Maybe they realized how out of line their demands were. "Wait," I asked, trying to make sure I'd heard him right. "You're asking me to pay off your house?" He nodded solemnly. "It's not just a request. It's a family custom. A way to show you're ready to provide not only for Lauren but for the family she comes from." I sat in my car for a long time, just staring at the receipts and notes, trying to make sense of it all. The betrayal wasn't just about the lie itself. It was how elaborate the whole setup had been. The pressure, the emotional manipulation, the way Patricia spoke of sacrifices and tradition with tears in her eyes, the dinner lectures from James trying to frame my refusal as immaturity, and through it all, Lauren had said nothing. Instead, I was met with another lecture. Over the next couple of days, I tried to sort through the mess in my head. Part of me still hoped Lauren would reach out and say something that made it all make sense, some missing piece that would pull this disaster into focus and offer a way forward. But nothing came. I looked at Lauren, expecting her to jump in, to call out her dad's audacity, but all she did was look away, visibly uncomfortable. "We'll talk about it later," she mumbled. James spoke like he was delivering a keynote address. He talked about family heritage, about unity, about standing together. He painted this poetic image of a family that supported each other, one generation to the next. And then, as if I hadn't heard it enough, he said, "This is your opportunity to prove that you're ready to be part of something greater than yourself." That night, I couldn't keep it in anymore. I called Lauren and asked, "Do you know what Alden Ridge Estates is?" I could hear the silence stretch on the other end of the call. What I kept returning to was that moment in the living room, when she said, "They're my parents. I can't turn my back on them." I realized that line wasn't just about this situation. It was a declaration, a position, and if push came to shove, she would always default to protecting them, no matter what they'd done. And that wasn't something I could live with. Dinner carried on like normal, but I was miles away mentally. Who demands such a thing from their future son-in-law? And why had Laura never mentioned this supposed tradition? She didn't respond right away. When I said it again, firmer this time, she finally asked, "Where did you get that?" That was it. That was the moment I mentally walked out. Because what James didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that I didn't need to prove anything, not to them. I already knew who I was. I knew my values, and being a part of a family shouldn't require financial servitude. Back at my apartment, I brought it up the moment we walked through the door. "What the hell was that?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "Your dad asked me to pay off their entire mortgage. Did you know this was coming?" Because marriage, real marriage, means choosing your partner, not just in the good moments but when things get hard. It means standing up for each other, even if it means having hard conversations with your family, especially then. And Lauren wasn't ready to do that. By the time Lauren and I left their house that night, something inside me had shifted. I wasn't just battling a bad situation. I was standing up for myself, in a way I never had before. "It doesn't matter," I said. "What matters is that your parents have been lying to me. They don't want help with their mortgage. They want me to pay for your dad's rehab. Did you know?" I didn't need her to abandon her parents. I needed her to see what was wrong, to acknowledge it, and to protect the life we were trying to build. But she hadn't. She couldn't. Or worse, she wouldn't. She hesitated. I didn't know he'd bring it up tonight, but yeah, I knew it might come up eventually. There was a long pause. Then she sighed and said quietly, "I didn't think you'd find out like this. This wasn't about tradition, it was about power, and I wasn't going to let them take mine away." I was floored. "And you didn't think that was worth mentioning?" So she had known. The clarity hurt, but it was necessary. Things finally reached a breaking point when James tried to guilt me by invoking some twisted version of family tradition. He brought up Lauren's grandparents, trying to set a precedent. "When I married Patricia," he said with that familiar smugness, "I helped her parents buy their first home. It's just how we've always done things." By the end of that week I knew there was no wedding. Not now, maybe not ever. She grew defensive. "I didn't think it was a big deal. I figured we'd talk about it when the time was right." That simple confirmation sent a shockwave through me. I felt anger and disbelief boiling inside. "How long have you known?" I asked. That was it. I couldn't hold back anymore. I stared at her in disbelief. "Lauren, they're not asking for a favor. They want me to pay off their entire house. That's not some minor thing. It's absolutely insane." Looking him straight in the eye, I responded, "With all due respect, that's not how things are done in my family." I was raised to take care of my own responsibilities, not to shoulder someone else's debt. She sat down on the couch, her voice low. Last year, he had a problem, gambling. It got out of control. My mom made him go, but the place they picked was expensive, more than they expected. Then, as if things hadn't already spiraled out of control, I got a call from one of my coworkers, a guy I'd only had casual conversations with. His tone was hesitant, almost embarrassed, like he wasn't sure if he should even be telling me this. "Hey man," he said. "I thought you should know James called me." "And your solution," I said coldly, "was to lie to me, to let me believe I was paying off a mortgage when I was actually covering your dad's rehab?" His expression turned condescending in a heartbeat. He gave me this patronizing smile and said, "You're still a boy. You'll understand when you're older." I blinked. "James? As in Lauren's dad?" She let out a sigh. "I know it's a lot, but it means something to them. They've done a lot for me over the years. This is just part of how they show what matters in our family." I asked her point blank if she thought this was a reasonable request. She shrugged and said, "Maybe there's a way to make it work. You've got savings, and we could always look into a small loan if necessary." "It's not like that," she said quickly. "They didn't know how to tell you. They were afraid you'd say no." That was the last straw. I stood up, excused myself, and told Lauren I'd be waiting for her in the car. I couldn't sit there and absorb any more of their lectures, their unrealistic expectations, or their manipulative tactics designed to make me feel inadequate. "I'd had enough." "Yeah," he replied. "He was asking questions about you, your job, your salary, whether you're financially stable enough to support a family. It was weird, kind of aggressive, honestly." I already said no, repeatedly, and instead of being honest, they doubled down with guilt trips and fake traditions. They questioned my commitment. Your mom even said I was untrustworthy. Later that evening, Lauren and I got into yet another argument. The tension between us was no longer about wedding plans or budgets. It had turned into something fundamentally deeper. I told her I couldn't continue down this path. "Your parents are crossing boundaries I didn't even know existed," I said. That was it. The final, unforgivable line had been crossed. That's when it hit me. She wasn't just tolerating their behavior. She was internalizing it, accepting it as normal. I was standing on the edge of a future that didn't just include Lauren, but her entire family's expectations, financial, emotional, and otherwise. I was already angry at the lies, the manipulation, the endless attempts to shame me into bailing James out of his gambling mess. But now he was trying to sabotage my reputation, involving my workplace. That was a step too far. I called Lauren and told her we needed to meet. This wasn't about resolving anything anymore. This was about closure. Instead of understanding, she got defensive. "Why are you making this such a big deal?" she shot back. "It's not like they want it all at once. We can work something out." Lauren didn't respond. She just kept defending them. "They've been under a lot of stress. They didn't mean to hurt you." That night, sleep was impossible. My mind kept racing through every conversation I'd had with James and Patricia. Was this what they'd been building up to all along? All those comments about tradition, responsibility, and being a real man, had it all been part of some orchestrated plan to secure financial benefits under the guise of family custom? And what bothered me even more was Lauren's reaction. She wasn't just blindsided, she seemed complicit. The fact that she knew this might come up and chose not to warn me felt like a breach of trust. It wasn't just about the money. It was about what this said about our partnership. We were supposed to be a team, but instead it felt like I was being thrown to the wolves while she stood by quietly. "But they did," I snapped. "They lied to me, they manipulated me, they treated me like a piggy bank." When we met up, there was no small talk, no pretense of working things out. I looked her in the eyes and said it as plainly as possible. "We're done." "Work something out?" I repeated, my voice rising with disbelief. "Lauren, this isn't a business deal. This is my life, my savings, my future. You're asking me to just hand it all over like it's no big deal?" And what hurt even more was Lauren's role in all of it. She hadn't come clean. She hadn't defended me. She had let the lies fester, hoping I'd cave under pressure. Her mouth opened slightly, stunned. "Wait, what? Can we just talk about this?" Over the next few days, I tried to process everything. I spoke to a couple of close friends and even confided in my older brother, who simply said, "That's not a tradition. That's extortion," with a smile. And he wasn't wrong. Every time I tried to rationalize their request, I kept coming back to one thing. It wasn't about respect or tradition. It was about control. James and Patricia wanted to test how much influence they could exert over me, how far they could push before I broke. She didn't offer a real answer. Instead, she clung to the same tired line. "I don't want to fight about this. Can't we just figure it out together?" But it didn't feel like we were figuring anything out as a team. I was in this battle alone, and she was merely watching from the sidelines, silent when she should have been standing with me. I started replaying every interaction with them through this new lens. The way James had subtly dismissed my ideas, The way Patricia had always found something to criticize. None of it seemed harmless anymore. It was a pattern, and I had ignored it because I loved Lauren. No, I interrupted. This isn't about talking. This isn't about working things out. Your parents have lied to me, manipulated me, disrespected me, and now your dad is calling my coworkers and questioning my character. You know about this? Why didn't you tell me? I asked again. Eventually, I realized I needed to confront this head-on. I arranged another dinner with Lauren's parents, this time at a restaurant. Her answer made my blood run cold. Because I didn't think it mattered. I figured if I told you the truth you'd back out. And I didn't want that. She looked down, guilty. He mentioned something, but I didn't think he'd actually do it. The final blow came not from James, but from Patricia. I shook my head in disbelief. Of course he did it, that's who he is. And you keep defending them. But forget them for a second, this is about us. And right now, it feels like I'm standing completely alone while you back them up. Out of nowhere, she called me directly. Her tone was sugary at first, uncomfortably so. We love you, and we're so thrilled to welcome you into the family, she began, but I could tell she was building up to something. Sure enough, her tone shifted. This isn't just about money. It's about trust. If we can't trust you to handle something this simple, how can we trust you to take care of Lauren? So instead, she let me be used. When we sat down, I didn't waste time with small talk. I looked James in the eye and said, I've been thinking about what you said the other night, about paying off your mortgage. He gave a smug smile, like he thought I was about to cave. Her eyes welled with tears, her voice trembling. I never wanted it to be like this. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a calculated deception designed to test how much I was willing to give, and how little they could get away with telling me. And Lauren had been complicit. I understand that traditions are important, I continued. But what you're asking for isn't tradition, it's a transaction. And I'm not entering this marriage to buy your approval. The next morning, I knew I had to talk to someone I could trust. I called my dad. I laid out everything, every receipt, every conversation, every red flag. He listened quietly and then sighed. This has nothing to do with trust, I said. It's about fairness, and what you're asking isn't fair. Well, this is where we are, I said, rising to my feet. And one more thing. Tell your parents to leave me alone. No more calls, no more voicemails, no more rumors. I'm done with this circus, and I'm done with you. Patricia's smile faded instantly. Lauren tensed beside me. Patricia's tone hardened instantly. Well, I just worry how this will look to the rest of the family if you refuse. People might start to think you're not really committed to this marriage. She sat there in silence, tearful, nodding quietly. I'm sorry, she whispered. He said. This isn't just a red flag. This is a billboard screaming at you to run. These people aren't just trying to take advantage of you. They're trying to control you. And if you let them do it now, it's only going to get worse. I already knew he was right. But hearing it from him, from someone I respected deeply, made it feel real. The illusion I had built around this family was shattering. I had been so focused on preserving peace, on keeping things moving toward the wedding, that I hadn't stopped to ask. I glanced at her one last time, then walked away. I didn't look back. I love your daughter, I said firmly. And I'm committed to building a future with her. But that future doesn't include funding someone else's retirement plan. If that's what it takes to be accepted into this family, then maybe this isn't the family I thought it was. I was stunned. That wasn't just pressure, it was a veiled threat. I calmly told her, I'm not changing my mind, and before I could say another word, she hung up. At that moment, something in me broke, not emotionally, but logically. I could no longer reconcile the woman I loved with the family she was connected to. The Lauren I fell for, the one who was kind, thoughtful, and grounded, would have never allowed this madness, or so I thought. But with every passing day, she seemed more aligned with her parents' views than mine. My dad left me with one final thought. If this is how they act before the wedding, imagine what your life will look like after. You need to be honest with them, and with yourself. That moment marked more than just the end of our relationship. It was the moment I reclaimed my peace. But deep down I knew this wasn't the last I'd hear from her family. The silence was deafening. James's expression hardened, and Patricia looked like she had just swallowed a lemon. Lauren looked torn, like a part of her was proud and another part was terrified. Every time I tried to explain how insane this all was, she acted like I was the problem. Like I was overreacting. But how could I move on when her parents weren't simply asking for help? They were testing how much control they could seize over my life. And Lauren was letting it happen. I stood up, placed enough cash on the table to cover the meal, and walked out. Lauren followed a few moments later. The next day, the texts began. When I hung up, my mind was made up. I wasn't sure what the exact next steps would be, but I knew I couldn't ignore this any longer. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. Because it wasn't. At first, they came from unknown numbers. The first message was vague. "You'll regret this." I brushed it off, thinking it was spam. Then another arrived, more pointed. "You don't just walk away from family obligations." That's when it finally clicked. This wasn't about the mortgage. It wasn't about family traditions or proving commitment. It was about power. Who held it, who wielded it, and who would be forced to surrender it. If I didn't draw the line now, I'd be trapped in a dynamic where I'd always be the outsider, the wallet, the scapegoat. This wasn't just about the money, it was about trust, and once that's gone, it's nearly impossible to get it back. We talked in the car, a long, painful conversation that dug into everything. Our values, our future, her loyalty to her parents versus her commitment to me. It wasn't pretty, and it didn't resolve everything in one night, but it was honest. And that honesty laid the foundation for what came next. After sitting with everything for a day, I realized that if I didn't take action, I'd be sending a message that I was okay being treated like this. And I wasn't, not by a long shot. I didn't know exactly what was coming next, but I knew one thing: something had to give, and soon. It didn't take a genius to figure out who was behind it. I ignored them, hoping it would blow over, but the messages kept coming longer, more aggressive. James and Patricia weren't even trying to hide it anymore. We postponed the wedding, not canceled but postponed. We needed time to rebuild trust, to establish boundaries, and to decide what kind of marriage we were really preparing for. I called Lauren that evening. I told her we needed to talk, not just the two of us but with her parents too. There was too much at stake to let this fester any longer. In the end, James and Patricia never apologized, but they also never brought up the mortgage again, and that in itself was a kind of victory. Because sometimes, standing your ground isn't just about saying no. It's about showing people that your worth isn't measured by your wallet, but by your principles. The support I found in online communities gave me the courage to keep talking about it. People shared their own stories, offered advice, and helped me realize I wasn't being unreasonable. This wasn't normal behavior, not for future in-laws, not for anyone. "You're making a mistake you'll regret for the rest of your life," one read. "And if that ruins their image of a perfect family, so be it." Another said, "You clearly don't understand what it means to be part of a family, selfish." But just when I thought the pressure couldn't get worse, I began suspecting there was more to this than I initially realized. The intensity with which James and Patricia pushed this mortgage demand didn't feel like simple stubbornness. It felt calculated, as if they were operating from a script. I had to draw the line, and they needed to see exactly where it stood. I blocked the numbers, thinking that would be the end of it. It wasn't. I wasn't angry anymore. I was clear. I knew what I deserved in a relationship: honesty, respect, and partnership. And if this family couldn't offer that, then maybe they weren't the family I was meant to join. I was ready to speak my truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made them. One night, after another argument with Lauren, where she dismissed my concerns and told me to stop overthinking, I decided to do something I hadn't before: investigate. This wasn't just about a financial disagreement. It was about knowing my worth and standing firm against being manipulated. When Lauren first told me that her parents expected me to pay off their mortgage, I couldn't wrap my head around it. I told her plainly, "I'm not comfortable with this," hoping she'd see how absurd it was. Instead, she responded gently, almost pleading, "Let's just think about it, okay? I don't want to upset them." That answer didn't sit well with me, but I bit my tongue for the moment, because some things like integrity weren't up for negotiation. In the days that followed, the pressure didn't let up. Patricia, in her typical passive-aggressive style, began lacing her conversations with pointed remarks. "It's a small price to pay for becoming part of such a wonderful family," she'd say, her tone sugary but firm. Meanwhile, James behaved like the decision had already been made. It was as if, in his mind, I'd signed some invisible contract when I proposed to Lauren. It started with a detail that had lingered in the back of my mind. During that strange cafe meeting with James, the one that felt more like a contract negotiation than a conversation, he'd brought a folder with him. He'd been overly cautious with it, flipping through pages without letting me see too much. At the time, I didn't give it much thought, but now, I couldn't stop wondering what was in there. Patricia pivoted to voicemails. Her voice oozed with faux concern and veiled threats. "We've consulted with legal counsel," she said in one message, "and we're considering options if you don't make this right. You've wasted our time, our money, and our daughter's future." I texted Lauren and asked if she could talk to her dad about it. Her response was instant: "Just drop it, it's not important." It was surreal. They were trying to wear me down with fear and guilt. They wanted me to panic, to fold, to pay them off, just to make the harassment stop. One evening, James invited me to a cafe. He said he wanted to have a private talk man-to-man, he added with a patronizing smile. I went, hoping to at least set some boundaries, but when I arrived, he greeted me with a thick folder organized, tabbed, and filled with documents. Mortgage statements, amortization charts, payment schedules, even graphs showing how quickly the debt could be eliminated with lump sum contributions. He wasn't suggesting anymore. He was negotiating like we were closing a business deal. When I told Lauren we needed to have a serious talk with her parents, she hesitated. There was a flicker of resistance in her voice, like she was already regretting agreeing to it. "Fine," she said eventually, but with a sigh that sounded more annoyed than cooperative. "But can we at least try to keep it calm? I don't want this to turn into a fight." And then he said something that floored me. "This isn't just about the money," he said with a proud, almost smug expression. "This is about respect. Clear the mortgage, and you'll earn real standing in our family." The arrogance was staggering. I nodded politely and told him I needed time to think, but in my head I'd already made the decision. There was no universe where I'd do this, not for him, not for Patricia, not for any fabricated sense of respect. I gave a bitter laugh. "Lauren, your parents have been lying to me for weeks. I think I'm entitled to be upset." Instead, I called my lawyer. That raised every red flag I had. He told me to document everything, every text, every voicemail, every email, and then he drafted a formal cease and desist letter, which we sent by certified mail. Lauren never dismissed things so easily. Something wasn't right, and I was tired of being in the dark, so I picked up the phone and called James directly. That night, lying awake in bed, I found myself replaying every interaction with Lauren's parents. What kind of people treat marriage like a financial contract? And why was Lauren, the woman I loved, not pushing back against them? I felt like I was walking into a trap disguised as a family tradition. The following evening, I arrived at James and Patricia's house. Lauren was already there, pacing nervously near the front window when I pulled up. Her eyes met mine briefly as I walked up the steps, and I could see the dread etched into her face. James greeted me at the door with the same polished, artificial smile he always wore, and Patricia chimed in with her usual shuri condescension. "Nice to see you again." But this time, I wasn't playing along. For a few blissful days, everything went quiet. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd finally accepted it was over. "Hey James," I said as casually as I could. "I've been thinking about our meeting the other day. You had some papers with you, didn't you? You left them behind, didn't you?" I began noticing just how orchestrated everything seemed. Patricia's remarks became sharper, cloaked in polite conversation but barbed with guilt. One day, she spent an entire afternoon reminiscing about how much they'd sacrificed for Lauren: private school tuition, summer camps, her first car. She ended with, "We've always done everything for her. Now it's time for her future husband to step up." I nearly laughed out loud in disbelief. Since when did marrying someone come with a retroactive bill? But Patricia wasn't finished. Once we were all seated in the living room, I didn't waste a second. "We need to talk about this mortgage, or whatever term you've been using to sell your story," I began, my tone sharp. There was a pause, long enough to make me think I'd touched a nerve. James furrowed his brow and leaned back in his seat. "What's there to talk about?" he asked, feigning confusion, like he hadn't spent the last month orchestrating a deception. "Oh, those," he finally said. "Just some financial notes I was working on, nothing important. Don't worry about it." This time she took the battle public, on social media. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the receipt from Alden Ridge Estates. I placed it squarely on the coffee table between us. It started with vague, passive-aggressive posts. "Some people don't know how to honor commitments," that sort of thing. Yeah, I didn't buy that for a second. But then, the gloves came off. She posted a long tirade accusing me of stringing Lauren along, wasting years of their family's time, and refusing to take responsibility like a real man. The next day, I returned to the cafe. Maybe it was paranoia, maybe it was intuition, but I had to know. I asked the manager if anyone had turned in a folder that had been left behind. "This," I said flatly. "This has nothing to do with a mortgage. You've been lying to me, and I want to know why." Patricia's face drained of color. James' posture stiffened. He leaned forward to squint at the receipt, then turned his gaze sharply toward Lauren. "You told him?" People shared it, commented. Some offered sympathy to her. Others thankfully knew me and reached out, confused and concerned. I had to explain the whole mess to people who had no business being involved in my personal life. To my surprise, he nodded and handed it over without hesitation. "Someone left this a while back," he said. And that was the moment I knew, whatever James had been trying to hide, it was now in my hands. Lauren, already shrinking in her seat, shook her head quickly. "No, he found it on his own." One friend texted, "She's making you sound like a monster, but anyone who actually knows you knows this is BS." I took the folder to my car, heart pounding as I opened it. The contents were surprising. At first glance, it was just as James described, financial documents. But as I dug deeper, it became clear that this wasn't just a collection of random notes. There were detailed projections, payment plans, and even notes in the margins referencing conversations between him and Patricia. One line stuck out to me. Make sure Lauren softens him up before the big ass. Another one. Frame it as family tradition, adds pressure. That admission made me feel sick. So you knew, I said, my voice trembling with restrained rage. You weren't going to tell me, and you were okay with that? That helped, a little. But the damage was done. Her post had been shared over 100 times. My name was in the mouths of people I'd never met. My reputation, something I'd built with honesty and hard work, was now entangled in the drama of a family I no longer wanted anything to do with. It hit me like a punch to the gut. Neither of them responded. I turned back to James and continued, "Do you even realize how insane this is? You've spent weeks manipulating me, pressuring me to take on tens of thousands of dollars of debt, all under the guise of some fake family tradition." James cleared his throat and tried to compose himself. "I don't know what you think you figured out, but this doesn't concern you." Lauren stayed silent. I thought maybe she'd finally started to see how toxic her parents were. But whether it was guilt or fear or misplaced loyalty, she didn't say a word. Not to defend me, not to stop them. They had planned this, not as a hopeful request, not as a spontaneous moment of tradition, but as a coordinated strategy to extract money from me, under the guise of cultural values and family expectations. I sat in my car, stunned, reading and rereading that folder. My chest tightened with a mix of betrayal, rage, and heartbreak. I'd been played. And not just by James and Patricia, but, by extension, by Lauren too. Whether knowingly or not, she was part of their plan. She was the conduit through which they believed they could control me. I was completely drained. That was it. I laughed, bitter, incredulous. "Doesn't concern me. You've been trying to guilt me into paying off your rehab bills, and you think it doesn't concern me?" The constant messages, the public shaming, the psychological warfare, it was relentless. But instead of breaking me down, it did the opposite. This wasn't about love anymore. It wasn't even about respect. It was manipulation, plain and simple. It confirmed, without a shadow of doubt, that I had made the right decision. Patricia jumped in, her voice rising in desperation. "It's not what you think. We were going to tell you eventually. We just didn't want you to get the wrong idea." When I got home that night, I didn't even try to sugarcoat things. I confronted Lauren with the folder. I showed her the notes, the plans, the words written in her parents' handwriting. Because if this was how they reacted to being told no, what would life have looked like if I had said yes? What would marriage have been like under the weight of their expectations, their interference, their drama? I shook my head slowly. "The only idea I have is that you're willing to lie and deceive to cover your tracks. You were going to let me start a marriage with your daughter based on a massive lie. That's not a misunderstanding, Nat." McAlliston himself made it clear that his lying must have been misunderstood. "That's manipulation." She went pale. James's controlled demeanor began to crumble. "You don't understand what we've been through," he said, his voice rising. "Do you think I wanted to go to that place? Do you think it was easy for us? I did what I had to do for this family, and now you're going to judge me for it." "No, I didn't just walk away from a problem." "Why were you going through that?" she asked weakly, avoiding my eyes. "Because you told me to drop it. Because every time I asked, you told me not to worry. And because I'm tired of being lied to," I said, my voice shaking. "You need to tell me right now. How much of this did you know?" I escaped a sinking ship. "No," I replied, keeping my voice level. "I'm not judging you for going to rehab. I'm judging you for trying to make me pay for it without telling me. You didn't give me a choice. You lied, and you framed it like I owed you something." Eventually, the noise started to fade. The social media posts stopped. The texts and voicemails dwindled. I started to feel like I could breathe again. Patricia's eyes welled with tears. "We've given Lauren everything. Private school, a car, her college education. Do you know how much we've sacrificed? And all we're asking is for a little help in return." She started crying, saying she didn't know about the folder specifically, but yes, she knew her parents hoped I'd agree to something big. "I thought if I told you up front you'd panic. I didn't want to lose you." I leaned forward. "Help? You didn't ask for help, you demanded it. You wrapped it up in guilt and obligation and tried to convince me it was tradition. That's not help, that's coercion." Lauren and I haven't spoken since that night, and honestly, I don't want to. She made her choices, I made mine. I'm not going to waste another second on someone who couldn't stand by me when it counted. "You didn't want to lose me, so you helped set me up?" I asked. Finally, Lauren spoke up. Her voice was quiet, strained. "Can we all just calm down? This isn't helping anything. If she wants to sit beside her parents and rationalize their manipulation, that's her burden to carry, not mine." She shook her head, but she had no real defense, no explanation that made sense. And in that moment, I saw the future clearly. I saw decades of bending to their will, of being cornered by manipulative tactics, of Lauren choosing her parents' comfort over my well-being. I couldn't do it. I turned to her, my heart heavy with disappointment. "Lauren, why are you still defending them? They lied to you too. How can you sit here and act like this is okay? Life goes on, and so do I. And I told her so. I'm not saying it's okay, she whispered, but they're my parents. I can't just turn my back on them. James and Patricia taught me a brutal but valuable lesson. I learned to recognize manipulation masquerading as tradition and entitlement disguised as family values. Most importantly, I learned to protect my peace, even if it meant burning bridges along the way. Her words hit me like a punch to the chest. I understood family loyalty, but there had to be a limit. And clearly, Lauren's limit was far beyond mine. I look back now and wish I had seen the red flag sooner, but I don't regret standing up for myself. I don't regret walking away. I don't regret choosing self-respect over obligation. That night marked the beginning of the end. Not because I stopped loving her, but because I finally started loving myself enough to walk away. Because no relationship, no matter how deep the feelings, should ever come at the cost of your dignity. I'll never forget the lesson I learned from Lauren and her parents. It's etched into my memory like a scar, a permanent reminder of what happens when you ignore the red flags and let people chip away at your boundaries in the name of love, tradition, or family. But just because it left a mark doesn't mean it gets to define who I am. They don't get that power. I won't let them shape the story of my life. Life is far too short and far too precious to be spent shackled to people who see you not as a partner, not as a person, but as a wallet or a status symbol. Relationships are supposed to be built on mutual respect, shared values, and honesty, not manipulation, guilt, or financial extortion. I gave that relationship everything I could: time, patience, trust. But the moment it became clear that none of it was enough, not without me paying a debt that was never mine, I knew I had to walk away. And yeah, it broke my heart to do it. I'm not going to pretend it didn't hurt to say goodbye to someone I once imagined a future with, but sometimes walking away isn't weakness, it's strength. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is choose yourself. So if you're in a situation like mine, if someone's trying to control you, shame you, or guilt you into giving more than you can afford, emotionally or financially, hear me when I say this. You don't owe anyone your future mind. You don't owe anyone your future. Protect your boundaries. Protect your energy. Protect your heart. Because at the end of the day, peace of mind isn't just worth something, it's worth everything.